Moving towards the core of the course. So today's perhaps the most important day. We'll be looking at a particular type of security which has evolved in order to deal with non-traditional security threats. This type of security is human security. Before we go through this, we need to recap what we looked at yesterday. So firstly, what do I mean by non-traditional security threats? We can probably look at the PowerPoint from yesterday. So what do you understand by non-traditional security threats?
These are more related to the...
Okay, again, in terms of protocol, I do have a list of your names, but please tell me your name before you make an intervention, and also put on the button, the talk button. After you've finished, please turn it off. Yep. Okay.
Myself, Gitanjali, and non-traditional security threats are more related to the economic, social, and environmental factors. And these include food security, or health issues, environmental issues.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohit. NTSC breaks the conventional national security currently. The NTSC includes human security, the environmental factors, the climate change. External factors or internal factors is break that currently.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else with a different idea? On non-traditional, what's a traditional security threat? That's important.
The power was the traditional one. It was related to the power.
Everything is related to power in politics.
External threats.
External threats. And where do these external threats come from? States. Yeah. So within the national security paradigm, a security threat is posed by an external threat from another state. Now, who remembers what a state is?
It's monopoly over the legitimacy of the to use the power over a territory.
That's very good. Yeah. Anybody else? I think that you've almost got it completely correct.
It's a system of organization that it creates some rules to conduct what we can do, things, economic things, that's military things, different things.
Okay, I'm going to say no, because that's not what we've looked at in the course. We've defined the state not in terms of what it is, but in terms of what it does, what it has. And what it has is a monopoly of the use of force within a given territory. Legitimacy is important, but not so important for realists. For realists, what is the most important form of legitimacy? Where does the state's legitimacy comes from? Please, yeah, okay. Comes from international recognition by other states. Now, how has globalization impacted upon this conventional understanding of security? Why are we talking about new non-traditional security threats? What has globalization done?
Because, Akhtar said, sir, we have some common problems which entire humanity is facing. So which were not pertaining to only national security paradigm. So they are beyond it, like we have global warming and we have the hole in ozone layer as well. So which no state entirely is responsible for.
Very good, but at the same time, arguably we've always had these problems, these common global problems. So why now? Or why in the 1990s? Why did these become problems then? What has changed? It's not the problems themselves.
The borders, actually the fall of 1991 USSR, the world is moved from two poles to a capitalist economy, and that would give birth to one world.
Because of technology, now we have got a sense that we are living in a common planet.
Yeah.
That's changed. It's not technology.
Yeah.
This is the problem. What has changed is our consciousness of belonging to a common planet. So an emerging global consciousness has changed as a result of satellite technology, of the collapse of the Soviet Union, integration into a global capitalist economy. So this has created an understanding that we are interconnected and that we face global threats which can only be dealt with at a global level. Now, before we move on to human security, what three main schools did we look at yesterday in terms of the globalization debate? I think everybody had a chance to speak.
Globalists, skeptics, and transformationists.
Okay, what's the first school of thought?
Globalists.
What do globalists argue?
They states that the role of state is eroding day by day by the globalization.
Excellent. Now, what is another school of thought? Let's hear from somebody over there. Skeptics. So go on.
Globalization has made state more powerful. The state is using that coercive power over its own citizens.
Yes, I think you're broadly correct. But what do most skeptics view? What do they think about globalization?
They think it's an...
Okay, over there.
Hi, this is Shailja. I think they most importantly say that the entire notion of globalization basically is a myth that is created by the developed nations.
What? So I can't hear because
I don't think it's working. Can you hear me? Yeah, so basically they say that globalization, the entire concept, is a myth that has been created by the developed nations.
Right. Yeah. So the idea of globalization is, if you could put it off, the idea of globalization is that globalization is a myth used by strong states. So it's actually states which are strengthening their power and using a discourse of globalization. So states are saying, if we take perhaps the anti-imperialist critique of globalization, the main argument is that powerful, strong states, the former imperial states, are using the myth of globalization in order to renegotiate the social contract between the governed and the governors. So the idea of a social contract was that the state would provide certain goods and services to its citizens. Even if we look at communist societies, the understanding of a communist society was that the state would provide you with health and education and jobs. So what's happening under globalization is that powerful states are saying, look, we can't provide you with jobs, we can't provide you with health, education, or free education, but we can build nuclear weapons. We can invade other places. We can spend $3 trillion on technology. So this would be the radical skeptic argument, the anti-globalist argument. But there are also traditional skeptics, traditionalists or conservative skeptics. Arguably, President Trump is one of them. What would they argue?
They see it more as a negative phenomenon.
Yeah, but so do the anti-imperialists. We're talking about two different types of skeptics.
I think traditionalists believe that their main focus would be on national security. I mean, to take Trump's example, for instance, where he's trying to close down borders. So it's basically a sense of insecurity regarding, say, for example, refugee crisis or migration.
Excellent. You mentioned the key word here, which is migration. So for skeptics, they're very skeptical about the claims that states should take in migrants and refugees. In the words of Samuel P. Huntington in his book, Who Are We? Migration, and particularly migration from different cultural backgrounds, so migration from Islamic cultural zones in Europe and in North America, prompts societies such as Germany, Italy, even the United States, France, which is Republican, to re-examine the source of its own identity. So skeptics here would prefer a national security paradigm. They prefer closed borders. So for radical skeptics, it's capital which is the problem. Capital is allowed to go everywhere, the mobility of capital. For conservative skeptics, it's migration, the mobility of labor, which is the problem. And finally, what is the final school of thought I introduced you to? Okay, now what do transformationalists argue? One at a time, so please. Let's hear from somebody outside, in the periphery. No, you have only 3 people in the periphery. Okay. Anybody? What's a transformationalist? What do they argue? Okay, I'll open up. Yeah.
The transformationists argue that there are multiple centers of the sovereignty is not only limited to the state, but it is also now being shared by or being co-opted by the other agencies apart from the state. Also, at the same time, in the process of global governance, the emergence of the different other organizations along with the state, other institutions, I mean, maybe the NGOs or the other civil society organizations. So,
how would this differ from the globalist perspective?
Basically, globalist perspective, they say that globalization is inevitable, and then and certainly because it differs from globalist perspective by because it moves from the traditional role of the state and coping with the process of globalization.
Anyone else?
Transformation.
One at a time. Please introduce yourself first.
I am Badr from Peace and Conflict Studies. Transformationalist argues that the state had a role to play, but globalists, they argue that the state powers are withering away.
The role of the state itself is changing. Now, this allows us to move on to non-traditional security threats, which was my original question. So in terms of non-traditional security threat, what are these threats? What constitutes a non-traditional security threat? So give me examples. I gave quite a few examples. Yeah.
Illegal migration.
Say your name.
Oh, my name is Mehvish. Illegal migration, human trafficking.
Sir, organized crime? Organized crime?
Organized crime, yeah.
Crisis.
Okay. Now, why can't the national security paradigm deal with these? Why can't the national security paradigm deal with these non-traditional security? Yeah. So basically what globalization is doing is changing our notion of inside and outside. So previously, if we look at the national security paradigm, it makes sense. Remember, hegemony is related to something which makes sense. It's a commonsensical framework, to use Gramsci's terms. So it makes sense only if there are clear lines between inside and outside. If you can clearly draw the line between India and Pakistan or India and Bangladesh, and to think of them as separate states, or between France and Algeria, or Britain and India, or Britain and Pakistan, then you can talk in terms of external threats. But what globalization has done, particularly the proliferation, not just of people and the mobility of capital, but also information and information flows, is this allows people in different forms of the world, parts of the world, to become interconnected. This creates an embryonic global consciousness, which makes inside and outside redundant. Or there are new insides and new outsides. So there could be an inside and outside of Delhi, for example, rather than a global south which includes all of India and China, and a global north which includes most of the West. There are parts of the West which are much poorer than India and China, or at least the metropolitan centers within India and China. So this is really where globalization is important. So one of the assumptions upon which the course is based is that there is something happening. Globalization is transforming the nature of state power, and this poses global challenges which the national security paradigm cannot deal with on its own. Okay? This allows us to talk in terms of different concepts of security. So I isolated different concepts of security which have arisen as a result of the impact of globalization on security. So we looked at environmental security, financial security, food security, global security, gender security, health security, and our focus today would be on human security. I will return to ontological security in the final lecture, because that will be based on my ongoing research. Okay, so I hope I've made the case for us looking at human security. And what I'd like to do now will be to briefly go through or introduce you to human security. Okay, I wanted to go for the introduction. Just a second. What question do you? Can we have questions afterwards? Because I need to finish the lecture first. So I think. Oh, yeah, but it has to be very quick because we need to finish this lecture at 3 o'clock. Yeah.
My name is Mudassir. Sir, as somebody referred towards the international recognition for a state is a must. It is what makes a state a state. But sir, during the, which is also, it is a true, you can't neglect it. But during the 1996 to 2001, the Taliban rule in Afghanistan, that was not recognized except 3 countries of the world, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. But it still was a state. Eventually, all the recognition from these United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia was also withdrawn. So, but still it was a state. If there would not have been 9/11, maybe Taliban would have been there, and international recognition would not have been there. But Afghanistan existed as a state.
Actually, this is relevant. The point I'll try to make, this illustrates the difference between 2 different types of sovereignty. internal sovereignty and external sovereignty. Internal sovereignty is based on monopoly of the legitimate use of force within a given territory. But let's say the legitimacy here of the Taliban depended upon external recognition. So I remember even at the time of the US invasion of Afghanistan, it was the Northern Alliance which represented Afghanistan in the United States and in other diplomatic capitals. So here there was a disjuncture between internal sovereignty, which actually on September the 12th, 2001, that was the highest extent of Taliban penetration and power within Afghanistan. Then, of course, you had a US invasion, and the US invasion allowed a transfer of sovereignty. So there's an alignment between internal sovereignty and external sovereignty. But it is very debatable the extent to which the Karzai administration, for example, was able to be a legitimate government, in that although it's externally sovereign, they needed elections in order to legitimize their sovereignty within the state. So I think it's a useful example of the difference between internal and external sovereignty. But if we can focus on the lecture today, we will be focusing on human security and the history of human security. We'll be looking at its origins, how it developed, where it came from. So far, we've only just looked at security. We haven't looked at the idea of a human security. I'll briefly be going through its history. So the history of human security. This will be very brief. I have a far more detailed PowerPoint outline. So if you have questions and discussion, I can show you it. But I want to be very brief when we look at the history. But the focus in the second lecture will be on the narrow and broad approaches of human security. And then we're going to have a discussion, but we're not going to have a discussion today. We'll have a discussion between 2 and 3 tomorrow. So please come prepared for your discussion. I would like to hear from everybody. Hearing from everybody means you have a maximum of 1 minute. I will cut you off. So it's very, very important. The narrow approach or the broad approach. I would like you to prepare for it. Possibly today I will send you a link, depending on if I can read your email addresses. If not, please look at my Academia EDU page, because you will find the link there and you can download it free of charge. So that shouldn't be a problem. Okay, let's look at the origins of human security. Most of the readings are in your course pack. So I would like you, for the narrow and the broad approach, to read the final article chapter, which is the Introduction to Protecting Human Security, which I wrote. That introduces you to the narrow and the broad approach. For those who are particularly interested in the broad approach, then please read the first reading. The first reading is very important. The first reading is the UNDP Human Security Report of 1994. And the second reading, which is on the narrow approach of human security. This reading is the Human Security Network out of Simon Fraser University in Canada. So those are the 3 main readings which I would like you to do in preparation for the discussion tomorrow. So the first reading, the second reading, and the last reading on protecting human security. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. The question I want to ask is, what is your understanding of human security? So again, please identify your name. Okay.
My name is Mahvish. For me, human security is to feel free, to have freedom.
Good, thank you. I like that definition. Do you have? Excellent, okay. I like this idea of people-centric security. I want to go over there first, yeah.
I'm Priyabala. According to me, human security is individual-centric, not state-centric. And secondly, it is the
Okay, good. Okay, yeah, you go first, yeah.
My name is Sabha. I think human security is freedom from fear and to have the basic rights.
Thank you.
Myself Gitanjali, and human security basically relates to the protection of vital cores of the human. That means freedom, rights, and involve the happiness and health issues as well.
Okay, I think Priya over there, and then you. Yeah.
While I agree with the point that it is people-centric, but one of the things that I do consider about human security that it should keep in mind the heterogeneity of the very term human. Okay, like in terms of incorporating cultural differences as well.
Why does it need to incorporate cultural differences? What is the...
Well, the reason it needs to incorporate cultural differences is because we have already seen the white man's burden, okay, in terms of colonization. So that was also the whole logic of it was actually bringing civilization to these backward areas. So when a concept like human security is propagated, it should not move along that path. I mean, like security, it also has a context. It changes from place to place. While, you know, the freedom is fine, but I think freedom also comes at a cost.
Yeah, my point here is freedom for whom? When we talk in terms of people-centric, which I like, what do we understand by people in the discourse of human security? I think your point is more similar to a critical point which I'll raise tomorrow, which is about the limitations of human security. But conventionally, when we talk of human security, it's security for whom? Huh? The individual. This is fundamentally important. The notion of human security is premised on the assumption that the individual human being is the only irreducible focus for discourse on security. In other words, human security is security for the individual. This is taken from McFarlane and Kohn. Consequently, the claims of all other reference, including the nation state, derive from the sovereignty of the individual. Now, what do you understand by the sovereignty of the individual?
The sanctity of rights.
See, this is where I depart. I think human security, this is only my view, but I think human security is a different concept from human rights. I also think that rights are only sacred in certain traditions. So I have written a chapter for a textbook in the UK called Global Politics, entitled Who Has Rights? And I make the claim that actually we don't have rights. Rights are something which are given to us by the state. Even human rights are ratified by states. So in this sense, we're not born with rights. Rights are political and legal entitlements which we are given. But what does it mean for the individual to be sovereign? Why, in other words, should we have rights? There's a difference between saying, do we have rights, and should we have rights? Why should we have rights? Yeah, but why? So what if we live free?
So that in case the state turns against the individual, they can protect themselves.
Yeah, but here we are looking at the sovereignty of the individual. So it's basically we have to say something about the individual. Rather, basically the point I'm trying to make is that state sovereignty, consequently the claims of other reference, including the nation state, derive from the sovereignty of the individual. Meaning that state sovereignty is dependent upon individual sovereignty. Therefore, actually, human security comes before state security. It's state sovereignty is afterwards. Human security is first.
We also say like state is the individual's writ large. So that's how basically it's like from
This
individual states created, when individual gives up his individual powers
Yeah.
and rests it with the state power.
See, this is what international relations does. What it does is it takes concepts from political theory and it scales them up to the level of the state. It imbues the state with an individual personality. What human security is saying is that no, states aren't sovereign. Individuals are sovereign. And the power of the state is dependent upon the sovereignty of the individual. So within political theory, where do we see this? The idea that states derive their legitimacy and sovereignty from the individual.
From Locke's theory.
Yeah.
Locke, and who was before Locke?
So, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes.
Absolutely, yeah. I prefer Hobbes to Locke because he's the great realist theorist, Hobbes, apparently. But what Hobbes is doing is saying, first, we are born in a state of nature where each human being has equal faculties to subdue and to kill another human being. Once we recognize that the state of nature permits a war of every man against every man, meaning everyone against everyone, which he calls anarchy, individuals would naturally come together and they would submit themselves to the power of what he called the Leviathan. So the Leviathan was a concept which was made up of the common man, which approximates to the state of today. So Hobbes is one of the first theorists of the state, and he introduced the idea of the state of nature. Hobbes did not begin with the state. He began with the individual in a state of nature. Now, what realism has done is it has taken the individual, taken the idea of Hobbes, taken the idea of anarchy, and forgotten about the individual. It says, look, it's states. We live in an anarchic world order. Hobbes was not saying we were living in an anarchic world order. Hobbes was saying we were living in a state of nature in which individuals were subject to a war of all against all, not states. And somewhere along the line, we forgot about this. We forgot that states actually don't exist. They're not human beings. They're abstract entities. What human security is trying to do is to ground state sovereignty in individual sovereignty. Now, what does it mean for the individual to be sovereign? Yep.
The very fact that individuals are rational human beings and they know what is right for them.
Excellent, yeah.
Decide on their own part as to what is right for them.
Say,
exercise their own independence, main choices.
Yeah. To be able to be a self-determining individual. To be an individual means the individual is a product of a particular history, European history. It was invented within the Renaissance. Why did it come about? It came about through René Descartes' argument of I think, therefore I am. Je pense que je sois. I think, therefore I am. The individual was a conscious being which thought itself into existence. So the individual is seen as rational, autonomous, and self-determining. Therefore, the individual should be sovereign. So the sovereignty of the nation-state depends upon its ability to protect the sovereignty of the individual. This is basically the argument in human security. Now, in terms of origins, we've looked at the origins of human security in the national security paradigm. This is where we have the idea of security. So security is something which is seen as a value. It has a normative value within international relations. Security is what all states seek, not peace. In international relations, I mean, I'm a director of Peace Center. But outside of my university, if you go to the United States, they're not interested in peace. They're interested in security. security here for the state. Security is seen as a good. It's a value. But where does the human come from? Well, the human comes from two sources. The first source is the literature on human rights, which we haven't looked at. So the literature on human rights talks in terms of rights for the individual. We can have collective rights, cultural rights, gender rights, indigenous rights, fourth generation rights. There's first, second, third, fourth generation human rights. But basically, first generation human rights was about the rights for the individual human being. If we look at human development, particularly in the work of Amartya Sen, we find that the object of human development is defined as freedom. Freedom for the individual. So this is a different conception of the actor. Within rights-based approaches, which share a lot of common rounds with human development, rights-based approaches privilege protecting the individual. Within human development, the focus is on empowering the individual. And we will look at the difference between the two when we look at the main approaches within human security. So basically, if we look at the reference of security discourse, what human security does is replace the main referent object of security. Within the national security paradigm, the main referent object of security discourse is the state. In human security, the main referent object of security discourse is the individual. Now, what can we say about the individual? It has already been said. We've already articulated this. But what can we say about the individual? You know, in this sense, the two ways of looking at it. The first way of looking at it would be to say, why should the individual be sovereign? The second way of looking at it is, what should the individual be in order for human security to work? Yeah, humans, but what is the difference between a human? What I do in my class is I say, you know, why don't we eat humans? This is more complicated within societies of South Asia, particularly when we look at Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. There is there is a distinction, but there isn't such a strong distinction between the human and other animals, as there are in Abrahamic traditions, as there are in other societies, where there's a very, very strong distinction. It's okay for you to eat, certain types of meat, but we cannot eat human. Australia is particularly interesting because they're really upset with Japan because the Japanese eat whales for some reason, even though the Australians eat kangaroos. But anyway, that's by the by. Yes, sorry.
We are the rational beings, right? We should be able to think rationally.
Exactly. This is the first and most important property of the individual human being. We are rational. We think, therefore we am. So when people talk in terms of natural rights, I don't see that there were natural rights. If we look at the evolution of human rights, natural rights occurred within a particular tradition, particularly the Christian tradition within looking at law, and also the Stoic tradition in ancient Greece. But it's really with the premise of rationality that we have the development of rights within the West. So the idea of rationality. For Weber, rationality is the key feature of modernity. Giddens, who we've looked at before, looking at globalization, for him it's about reflexivity. To be reflexive means to be rational. Now, what does rationality permit? If you're rational, what does this mean? What can you do if you're rational?
You can make choices.
Huh?
Making choices.
Decisions.
Excellent. You can make decisions. And making decisions makes you autonomous. Autonomy means being able to make decisions on your own behalf. However, there's one other feature of being an individual which arguably makes human security work and could, for many others, be seen as a drawback of human security. So the individual is seen as rational, autonomous. Okay, go ahead. Are you have?
Maximizing your interests, which might come up as negative.
Completely agree with you. Yes, maximization. Yes, this is particularly important when we look at a market economy.
Even otherwise, I being human being, if any of you place me anywhere in a situation, I'll try and maximize my own good. There's no end to the human greed.
I think this also ties up with the René Descartes' argument, like I think, therefore I am, which is why the whole Enlightenment theory came under criticism for positing human interest above the other interests.
Now, I completely agree. If the problem I have now is then this would lead us into a discussion of the relationship between human security and the market economy. And I think we can have that discussion tomorrow. What I don't want to say is that human security can only work in a market economy. If we look at Sen's work on human development, I think a very strong argument can be made for saying that what he's trying to do is to humanize the market, to say that there's no alternative to a market economy, but at the same time, we should look at the benefits which a market economy can have, let's say, for the poor. I think we should move away from that economic dimension temporarily. But if we're going to be critical of the individual, of the conception of the individual in human rights and human security literature, what else can we say about the individual? What about the individual? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to add something. So there's a term in Islam which determines what makes a human human. So it's called Ashraful Makhluqat, which in turn means rational and autonomous. So that's the concept.
Yeah, but this is an excellent explanation of what I'm trying to get at. Why is that not there within the literature? Why is that not there within the literature? Why do they not start with the term? Mabul al-Haq, he was Muslim when he came up with the Human Development Reports of 1994, which you're all going to read. Why didn't he start with this assumption? Why didn't he start with looking at Islamic thought or Islamic doctrines? What's the assumption here made about the individual? It comes back to your point earlier. Huh? No. But why can't we start with looking at great cultural traditions and look?
Probably because our discourse on individual is completely based on Western secular idea.
Sorry?
It's completely based on the Western secular idea. You cannot consider faith, culture, much more into that.
Very good. It starts with a notion of the individual. I wouldn't say as Western. It is Western, but it's not as Western. It starts from the idea of a view from nowhere. A view from nowhere means the individual can exist everywhere. The individual is the basic unit of society. Now, the term I will use, following Stephen Hopgood, is unencumbered. Now, within philosophy, I've been told I'm using this wrong in terms of unencumbered. But I think the notion of the unencumbered individual for Hopgood and other critics of human rights would be to say that the individual is not encumbered by attachments to others. So to be encumbered means really to be attached, but it's like a hindrance. So in this sense, the unencumbered individual is an individual who is not born within a particular cultural tradition, who's not born with a particular agenda. This is, if we look at the feminist critique of human rights, it posits the idea of this abstract individual which is usually a male individual. It's not necessarily a male individual, but because it's not sensitive to the needs of women, it understands rights and the priority of rights from a particular perspective, which is that of the male. And consequently can also say that it's a very secular understanding of the individual. And if we look at critiques of secularism, many people such as Talal Assad and Charles Taylor and Joseph Casanova have argued, and I also follow them, in saying that our idea of secularism is really rooted in the experience of the West. So when we talk of secularism or a secular public culture, we're really talking about a secularized Christian culture. So in this sense, unencumbered is very important. So it means what this permits us to do is to make statements about the individual in general from everywhere, from the perspective here of nowhere, a universal conception of the individual. Within political theory, you see this within the work of John Rawls in his theory of justice. So Rawls, again, he takes us, it's like social contract theory. He takes us out of where we are, and he says, now let's assume there's a veil of ignorance. We don't know where we are. We don't know who we're going to get. What would our ideal form of society be? But John Rawls is somebody. He is sitting at Harvard. He is a male. He is from a privileged position within the world economy. So in this sense, he can extract himself for the benefit of his theory. But for many of us throughout the world, we can't do that. We don't have that luxury or that option. So I think it's quite important to bear this in mind when we look at critiques of human security. It's similar to the critique of social contract theorizing within political theory, and the work of Hobbes and then Locke, and also Rawls and others. Now, very briefly, what I would like to do before we break is to look at the history of the development of human security. Now, I'm just going to mention some of the important developments, but what I would like you to do is to research this. Most of this information is available on the web. They're freely downloadable. We have reproduced for you the first two important reports, or at least the first and the third important report. The first and most important report is the United Nations Development Programme Human Development Report of 1994. We can go into this in greater depth after the break. But the significance of the UNDP Human Development Report, which is the first reading in your package, is that it introduced the term human security. Now, the key question here, which I would like you to answer after the break, is why use security when you're writing a development report? What is the advantage of using the language of security? Most of these people, Mahabul al-Haq, Amartya Sen, the people who worked compiling the report, were economists. They were developmental economists. They were not international relations experts. They never studied security studies. So why use the concept of security? And why use the concept of security in 1994? 1994 was a key year for the development of human security. So I'd like you to think about that, and maybe you can discuss this after the break. The second report is completely different report. The International Conference on Intervention and State Sovereignty, Responsibility to Protect report of 2001. Now again, I'm going to give you a date. The date is 1999. That's when this report was commissioned. Now, the report was commissioned by the UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan, but the people who sat on the table would not be seen as representatives of superpowers, but mainly of middle powers. So you had strong United Nations presence. Ramesh Thakur, who was vice rector of the UNU, United Nations University, was part of this. It was chaired by Gareth Evans, the Australian foreign minister. You had representation from Canada. I'm not sure, maybe Japan, but probably not. And so it's mainly Canada, Australia, and the United Nations. Now, what is important about this report is it clarified the grounds for humanitarian intervention. And although human security is not explicitly mentioned, they did articulate a concept which is associated with human security, which is the responsibility to protect. So the argument of the responsibility to protect is that states have a responsibility to protect the populations under their control, in their territory. If they don't do so, then humanitarian intervention is possible. This was further clarified. An attempt was made in the Commission for Human Security report, final report, Human Security Now, to basically marry these two approaches. The first approach looked at freedom from want. It prioritized development. The second approach looked at freedom from fear, prioritizing freedom from the state and the violence of the state. And under the Commission for Human Security report, which was funded by the Japanese government, but which was chaired by Sadako Ogata, who is at my university, and she was head of the UNHCR, the refugee agency, and also significantly by Amartya Sen. The Human Security Now report made the case for looking at human security as encompassing both freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to take decisions on one's own behalf. So this is a very important report. It should be in your pack. If not, you'll be able to download it from the internet. And I think everybody should have a look at this report. The 2009 UN Secretary General's report was an attempt to further codify the responsibility to protect. So the responsibility to protect argued that in cases where states had failed in their responsibility to protect the populations under their control, intervention by the international community was legitimized. So in 2009, we have the further codification of this report with the three pillars. So the first pillar is the responsibility of states to protect its people. The second pillar is the capacity of the state to protect its people. So this looks at capacity building, strengthening failed states. So it's very difficult for, let's say, Somalia to protect all the people within its control. Arguably, it's difficult today for Syria to do so because it doesn't control all of its territory or parts of Iraq. So in this sense, capacity building meant strengthening the state so the state can protect the people under its control. But the final pillar meant that when a state was willing or unwilling, was unwilling and capable, yet capable, so capable of protecting everybody under its control, yet unwilling to do so, then humanitarian intervention by the international community was justified. And what's important, again, is the date. This is 2009. Something happened in 2011. So the three dates we have for you. 1994. Actually, we have 4 dates, 4 reports. 1994, significance. The 1999. Now we can say 2001 and 2003 are also very significant dates. And then 2011. So these are all important dates. You see, the difference is, if we look at the Human Security Now report, this was published in 2003. It was pretty quick. But the R2P report in 2001 was commissioned in 1999. So although it came out, I think, a month after the US-led invasion of Afghanistan, it wasn't prompted by this. It wasn't prompted by the invasion of Afghanistan. It was prompted by an event in 1999. So 94, 99, and then we can look at 2003 and 2011. Other reports, I haven't looked at so far. So, okay, there is one other report which should be here, which I don't think, maybe it's in a different PowerPoint. Let me just see. I think I mentioned the UN 2012, the UN General Assembly resolution, which you can download, again, free of charge from the UN websites, 66-290, 2012. Now, we'll look at this briefly afterwards, but what this resolution did was to first institutionalize human security. So you had a General Assembly resolution which adopted the concept of human security and defined it as the right of people to live in freedom and dignity. But we will see the other definitions after the break of the other ways in which human security was defined by that report. And to bring this up to date, very recently in May this year, 2016, there was the Berlin report of the Human Security Studies Group, which is based at the London School of Economics, headed by Mary Calder. And this was presented to the European Union Foreign Affairs Minister, Federica Moretti. Now, this is seen as human security 2.0, second generation human security. We'll look at that tomorrow because that is a concerted attempt to deal with criticism of the first generation of human security. But of fundamental importance is the UNDP Human Development Report of 1994, the Human Security Now report, and the UN General Assembly resolution of 2012. Okay, I'll see you after the break when we can discuss these in greater depth.